Understanding the gaps in Africa's archaeological record. Sites and artifacts are revealing clues to the continent's recent history. An archaeologist explains the findings and threats to this heritage. Gedi Courthouse. Gedi is another pre-colonial African site that was occupied from about 1000 to 1500 CE. The courthouse from the site is shown. Chaparuka M. Kusimba. Amber Dance, Knowable Magazine. August 15, 2025. Get our newsletter. Key takeaways: Africa and archaeology. Big gaps exist in the history of Africa at the time permanent settlements were forming elsewhere around the globe. Advances in East African archaeology document advanced civilizations that traded internationally and developed technologies during the most recent 11,700 years. The continent of Africa is recognized as the place where humankind originated and evolved over millennia. From famous ancestors like Lucy, the Australopithecus afarensis remains unearthed in Ethiopia in 1974, to the Turkana boy, a Homo erectus fossil found in Kenya in 1984. Archaeological evidence has shown time and again that Africa is the ultimate homeland of not just early hominins but also modern Homo sapiens, who arose about 300,000 years ago and departed in successive waves to populate much of Earth. Of course, the story of humans in Africa doesn't end with their migration away from the mother continent. After all, many stayed put. But there's a big information gap. Although researchers have plumbed much of humankind's deep past, far less is known about what was happening across much of Africa at the time when permanent settlements were emerging elsewhere starting some 6,000 years ago, in places like Mesopotamia, for example, and later in China and India, as well as Egypt and Africa's northeastern tip. Archaeologist Chaparuka M. Kusimba. Archaeologist Chaparuka M. Kusimba of the University of South Florida James Provost C.C. Byandi. In part, that's because African individuals did not cram together as closely as they did in more well-known cradles of civilization. So it's less likely that modern archaeologists will discover major towns or cities. Another factor is the slave trade that slashed a 400-year wound through African history and led many communities to be abandoned. Long-standing biases about the continent, too, have left the full story of Africa's cultures, trade and urbanism out of many history lessons. That's starting to change. Recent advances in East African archaeology reveal advanced civilizations that established international trade relationships and developed powerful and practical technologies during the most recent 11,700 years, the Holocene epoch, as Chaparuka M. Kusimba, an archaeologist at the University of South Florida in Tampa, describes in the 2024 Annual Review of Anthropology. Kusimba, who grew up in Kenya and has regularly returned there for research, says East African archaeology is evolving as more Africans and women join the field. Knowable Magazine spoke with Kusimba about Afri. The human origins question has been settled, but we know precious little about the emergence of civilization in Africa. Most Holocene archaeologists define civilization, in part, in terms of settling down in one place, which happened elsewhere starting around 6,000 years ago. But I think in Africa, that model creates a major problem because Africa is so huge, and population numbers remained low, so it was very difficult to have a critical mass of people to congregate together. So you can't find many places in Africa that you can compare with, for example, the Near East. That doesn't necessarily mean settlements didn't exist. But the jury's still out, because we don't have the kind of intensified site research that's been carried out in other places. And it's very difficult to conduct surveys, say, under the dunes of the Sahara Desert. That desert would have been much more habitable during the humid green savanna period 14,500 to 5,000 years ago, but it's just impossible to find sites under those massive sand dunes. We do know of some sites. For example, people were settling together as early as 3000 BCE in the site of Kidero along the Nile. There is evidence of houses, stone tools, pottery, and jewelry, as well as bones of people and domesticated animals. Still, Africanists can't compete with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with Mesoamerica. The result is that when you pull out any book that teaches civilization, there is only a very small section devoted to sub-Saharan civilizations. East Africa is home to many important archaeological sites that were settled in the Holocene era, a handful of which are shown in the above map. The landmass known in the post-colonial period as Madagascar is labeled to orient the viewer. The site of the discovery of the hominin Lucy in present-day Ethiopia is also shown. Knowable magazine. So what was going on in Africa as Mesopotamia and other regions were tending farms and building cities? The African communities appear to have been mobile much longer. We think this is true because there are few sites of long-term settlement. The sites that are well preserved tend to be rock shelter sites that were probably temporarily inhabited. Nonetheless, these people were highly advanced, they ate well and lived healthy lives. For example, the Sangoan peoples of Eastern and Central Africa had advanced stone tool technologies and bone fish hooks. And people were making carbon steel 2,000 years ago. There is often a tendency to think of the European Stone Age as the first, the original, the most sophisticated phase of stoneworking. But you have stone tool technologies in modern-day Ethiopia and Kenya starting 2.8 million to 3 million years ago, earlier than it began in Europe. Of course, the European Paleolithic tools were incredibly sophisticated, but the core stone was relatively easy to work. In contrast, African stone is much harder to work than European stone. If you give any modern flint-knapper African rock, they immediately recognize how difficult it is. But Africans were using these very tough materials to make extremely sophisticated tools. And what happened when Africans finally started to settle down? In most cases, permanent settlements appear in Africa 3,000 or 4,000 years after they did in places like the Near East. About 8,000 years ago, we begin to see more extensive evidence of settled life in modern-day Western Kenya, Eastern Uganda, and the African Great Lakes region, and I think climate change might have been a reason behind that societal change. Suddenly, around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago you have a dry spell that lasts for about 700 years, and that's when you see the introduction of pastured livestock. So Africans did get there eventually, but we don't see the real emergence of highly complex chiefdoms and societies, with more division of wealth, in much of Africa until about 2,500 years ago. That division of wealth is apparent in differences between households. Some have exotic items from distant places, and most others didn't. Just like today, there are things that only elites can acquire. Most likely, they were gifts, given to grease the wheels of business for trade of desirable items. For example, the port town of Mtwapa, near modern-day Mombasa, Kenya, was inhabited from about 1100 to 1750 CE. Wealthy inhabitants possessed multi-room homes with coral door frames and roof tiles, indoor plumbing and wells. Poorer denizens lived in single-room homes of mud and wood, with grass or coconut thatch roofs. Wealthy citizens also reserved the right to the most sacred burial places, near a key religious site. From about 2,000 years ago, there were towns all over sub-Saharan Africa, including inland and along the coasts. But many African settlements were smaller in size compared to similar communities elsewhere. For example, the medieval site of Gedi, in modern-day Kenya, was massive by African standards, but at about 48 acres of built-up areas, it was much smaller than contemporary sites in India, China, or the Near East. But we believe these sites were built and inhabited by Africans, not immigrants from other civilizations, because 96% of artifacts such as pottery, metals, and beads found in those cities are of local origin. A perfect example of an advanced community, located inland, would be the region of Great Zimbabwe, which was inhabited from about the 11th to 15th centuries CE. It covered about 50,000 square kilometers, 19,000 square miles, including early village settlements and a stone city built later. Great Zimbabwe is an amazing place, but the residential quarters were built out of mud, stone, and thatch, so they didn't preserve well archaeologically. How did these societies interact with the rest of the world? My work and the work of others shows that before the African slave trade, which reached the continent's interior with slave caravans starting in the 17th century, Africans were trading with other cultures. We found glass and carnelian beads of Indian origin in every archaeology site in sub-Saharan Africa. Chinese and Indian historians also describe the presence of African mariners in their own towns, so the trade was bidirectional. Africans traded ivory and gold for products such as Chinese porcelain and Indian cloth. Crops were also exchanged. For example, sorghum is a traditional African crop. It's hard to date its origins, but it was being cultivated in Africa from at least the 4th millennium BCE. And it arrives in places like India later. Meanwhile, the banana, first domesticated in Southeast Asia, arrived in Central Africa more than 1,000 years ago. And Africans were trading as equals. Here's one reason I think so. From at least 800 CE, there is clear evidence that people were engaging in the ivory trade, but they traded in mostly cut ivory. This allowed them to weigh it, grade it, and assign value consistent with quality. Cut ivory was also easier to transport from inland to trade partners on the coast. Before the slave trade, Africans financed and were in charge of the ivory and other industries.